As genealogists, we seek to find facts about our ancestors, and no ethnic group has a more complicated set of facts than African Americans in Pennsylvania. They had multiple statuses of citizenship and freedom within the colony and then later the Commonwealth. And they also moved a lot as a people seeking more freedom and more opportunity. I am really lucky in this episode of Your Pennsylvania Ancestors to welcome my colleague, another professional genealogist, Dean Henry, who is an expert in African-American research and is going to help me deal with some of my misconceptions around African-American research, provide a ton of resources for those of you researching African-Americans or wanting to jump into African-American research, and also just share some fun stories about his family, what he found in his research. And it's a jam-packed episode, as it always is with this podcast. I hope you enjoyed the time with Dean like I did, and we're just really lucky to get to share time together. Sort of a benefit of the pandemic, we got to sit down and have a longer conversation than we've had before. I'm so thrilled you get to meet him right now. Dean Henry, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited that we got to connect in the midst of the pandemic here.
Yeah.
And finally, yeah, I know. And finally sit down and talk about African-American research and history, a little bit of history, a lot of genealogy here in Pennsylvania. Tell us about yourself, how you got started in genealogy, and touch on your business, because I want people to hear about that too.
Sure. So first of all, thanks, Denise, for having me on your show. People may not know this, but we met through the Association of Professional Genealogists, the Greater Philadelphia Area chapter. Hence, I have Philadelphia in the background here. I actually live outside of Philly, but did grow up in Philadelphia. So you asked about my background. I actually grew up in West Philadelphia, born and raised, and I spent my whole life in the Delaware Valley. I was working for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia right after graduation from high school and never left the area. I spent my whole career in information technology and dabbled in family history in the late 80s, actually. And that's because my sister-in-law was having a family reunion, and she wanted the computer geek in the family to organize the family members that she had on 3x5 cards. So that's how I got hooked, by doing that in the late 80s, but never really decided to do this professionally until I retired from a full-time IT career. So actually in 2012, 2013 is when I began to really focus on my addiction to family history research and joined the Association of Professional Genealogists and became active in that chapter. So my business is called Family Pearl, taking that thought about pearls of wisdom that are passed on from your grandmother or whatever. So my website is familypearl.com, and I decided to focus on a couple of areas. One is African-American genealogy research, and the other was the intersection between technology and genealogy. So I've been at this for, I guess, about 8 years now, and I'm really getting a lot more into it in this pandemic area, because as you mentioned, we really can't get out a lot, so we can focus now on our genealogy research.
So let's dive in. You did a boatload of preparation for this episode to make sure that people listening understand, the breadth of what's available for African-American research. And I started one of my questions to you, for people that in their family tree, they look at it and they've got all Europeans, they've got the Irish, the Germans, the Norwegians, the Swedes, they think, well, why would I do African-American research, or what do I have to do about it? And I want to remind people listening that Pennsylvania had the institution of slavery throughout its entire history. So you might run across someone in your family tree who you think, oh, they're from Pennsylvania, they didn't have slaves. So can you just talk a little bit about that? Like what did slavery look like in Pennsylvania? What was that history for people?
So to your point, Denise, there was at least one slave in Pennsylvania as early as 1639. So a lot of people are surprised to hear that. They're surprised to hear that Philadelphia was actually one of the major ports, was the major regional port for importation of slaves in the area. So there could have been an ancestor that you're researching, if you're African American, that has actually been in Philadelphia directly from Africa or from somewhere in between in the transatlantic slave trade. So that's pretty amazing. And we were talking earlier, you said you were surprised, and I was surprised to learn, I guess in the last 10 years or so, that there were slaves in so many places around the state of Pennsylvania. A lot of people think of the old Roots book and the TV miniseries, and they think all African Americans have a similar background where they have family that was enslaved and they were freed after the Civil War. But no, that's not the case in a lot of African Americans. They may have actually been in a household where they were an indentured servant or actually a slave, and actually in Pennsylvania. So it really depends on your family story. And another point I want to react to, you said, why would I, as a European American, want to study African American history and research? Well, two reasons. One is your ancestors may have actually owned a slave or two in the past, and you might find that surprising. You might want to reach out to some of the descendants. Some people are actually doing that, reaching out to descendants of the people that their family had enslaved in the past, just to establish the connection for whatever reason, to say, I'm sorry, it wasn't me, or what can I do to help, or just to learn about the story. That's one. And a lot of other people may be surprised to know that they actually have an African American in their family history. I actually found a case very recently where actually in my family, distant families, family who primarily thought that they descended from a Revolutionary War soldier who was white, and actually he was not white. So over the years, because of intermarriage, by all appearances, they appear to be white, but they actually have at least one African-American or partially African-American, or African, I should say, in their family history. So there's a couple of reasons right there that you might want to do research.
Oh, those are great points. I think with the advent of DNA testing, we've all had those surprises in our
Yes.
family trees.
Yes. And I guess you could call me a mutt. I mean, I have everything you could possibly think of: Irish, Scottish. I even have some Swedish. I'm trying to track down that line right now because of the first Swede that came into the Philadelphia area, Peter Gunnson Rambo. I believe I know my ancestors were owned by him, and he's actually interred here, right here in Philadelphia. So maybe that accounts for the 1 or 2% Swedish I have, according to Ancestry.com. So it's really interesting once you get your DNA test done.
That is so cool. You're getting the whirlwind tour then. I'm always jealous of people that get that like huge, like, map back, with their DNA, because mine is like, boop. It's like this little.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, well, that's, not very much. I mean, no matter what your family is, it's rewarding to do the research, but
Yes.
I think it was a little bit of a letdown, honestly, when I got it back. So tell me about doing African American research in Pennsylvania. So we were talking, as you mentioned before the podcast, and I focus a lot of my questions around this slavery and the institution of it and what the records are. But we actually have the majority of African Americans in Pennsylvania came with the Great Migration, which was right around World War I. It started, and then to about 1970. So you tell me, what do I need to know as a researcher?
So you asked me originally to talk about researching African Americans in Pennsylvania, and you may know I gave this talk a couple of times at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I always start out with the context, because you have to really think about, okay, so what is African American? And I say that kind of jokingly, and I flash up a slide asking people, show of hands, how many of you think this person is African American or that person? I show Charlize Theron, I show Barack Obama, et cetera. I said, they're all African American. I said, show of hands, how many of people here are African American or identify? And hardly any hands go up. And I said, I flashed up Scientific American and said, well, you all originate from the continent of Africa. We all do. So it depends how far you go back. But so when you say African American, when you're doing genealogy research, people of color who have ancestors from Africa may have been identified, say, in the UN Census as Negro or colored or mulatto or Black. or they may have been identified as white depending upon their complexion and how they identified. So I think there is a lot of context you need to know, and I'll probably sprinkle some of that in as we talk. But specifically to your point about the Great Migration, both on my mother's side of the family, both her mother and father grew up in Caroline County, Maryland. And it wasn't until the Great Migration where they moved from there to Philadelphia. Similarly, on my father's side, they came from my grandmother from Iron City, Georgia, and my grandfather from Quincy, Florida. So they came up during the Great Migration. So both sides of the family, they all came up north for jobs, better opportunities, and to escape some of the discrimination in the South. So if you're going to do this research, you have to try to figure out where did they come from. And some of the records that you're going to look at will probably take you back there. Some of the records down there may actually refer to records up here. It's not really a cookie cutter type of research subcategory, African American research. You have to kind of think on your feet. You have to know a lot of kind of context and surround yourself with a lot of people who are doing similar research, because they'll give you a little tip about, well, I tried to do that, and lo and behold, you break through what we call a brick wall.
Yeah, that's great. I get this image of you dancing around with others, back and forth between history and their stories and their experience in doing the research, because I think that's important for genealogists to know. It's never a straight line, your research. Let's talk about records that are particularly helpful to African American research. So fill us in on those records for people.
So again, you're asking about Pennsylvania records in particular, and your listeners should be aware that there are a lot of records that may apply to African American research, even though their ancestors were in Pennsylvania. So there are records such as the Freedmen's Bureau right after the Civil War. So if you're researching people who were formerly enslaved, the Freedmen's Bureau attempted to help out with land contracts and formalizing marriages and helping people find lost family members, or the Freedmen's Bank, which helped freedmen establish a bank account and save money, things of that nature. It may or may not apply to ancestors who lived in Pennsylvania. To your question, and you mentioned the Quakers, specifically the manumissions, that's a term that your listeners may not have heard about. Manumission, the term manumission means freed, legally freed from slavery. So manumission records are something that you would want to research if you think that the person that you're researching was enslaved in Pennsylvania, say. So the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, it contains manumissions and indentures from around 1780 to 1840, and they're arranged by master and slaveholder in records that can be found in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I mentioned that some of these records, or at least the indices, are online. There's a 7 microfilm reel set that can be viewed at a number of locations, including the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, or HSP. Another source could be local recorder of deeds office records, such as records that are available through the Chester County Historical Society. There they have a small index of, quote, slaves and masters, I hate using that term, that can be found online at chesco.org, and you would search for the word manumissions. And a lot of people may have heard of William Still and the Underground Railroad. There was several shows, TV shows recently I talked about William Still. Of course, he wrote a book, but he actually kept really detailed records about formerly enslaved as they passed through Philadelphia, being a point on the Underground Railroad. And he kept records of formerly enslaved passengers. HSP also provides access to a site called Family Ties that has information on enslaved individuals and families who passed through Philadelphia between 1855 and 1857. So those are the types of records that, if you're specifically looking at Pennsylvania and people who were formerly enslaved, you might want to focus on.
And you also mentioned some records that people would want to look at in context. Oh, you did mention the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yes, I mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau because maybe it doesn't really apply that much to the freed Blacks in Pennsylvania, but it may. But say if a person opened up a bank account for the first time, they may actually have listed their family members for the first time, and you'll find them in a Freedmen's Bank record. They may have actually listed their last enslaver, slave owner in that record. So if you're doing African-American genealogy research in general, that's definitely a good source. Those two things that you mentioned, Freedmen's Bank and Freedmen's Bureau, but it may or not apply up to people who were in the North really early on. But that's something you should still know. One example I gave was someone who was in the South, but he actually listed family members, and he actually listed one that was in Philadelphia in a Freedmen's
Oh,
Bank record. And I thought, wow, think about that. It's interesting that he knew he had a relative in Philadelphia. And it made me wonder the context of that. Did that person get sold south so they had a relative back in Philadelphia, or how did that transpire? You have all kinds of movements like that where your family could be sold south. You may remember the story 12 Years a Slave, where someone was actually in the North, was kidnapped and sold south as a slave. So you have African-American stories that are all kinds of movement, north, south, east, west, relocations. And another thing, name changes too. A lot of African-Americans changed their name right after they were freed, sometimes once or twice. So it makes this branch of research even more difficult if they change their names a couple of times.
wow. And I'm assuming there's not necessarily a formal record of that name change. They just picked a new name to be known by.
Right.
Okay.
It may not be official, not like when if you came in through Ellis Island and said, okay, you are now this name from now on. Like, oh, that's where that happened. Not necessarily. They may have adopted the last slave owner surname, and a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to do African-American research. My last name is Henry. I must have been enslaved by a Henry at some point. I haven't found an enslaver named Henry. And one thing for your listeners, if you happen to do Y-DNA research, which only males can do, if you go back generations for my father and his father, et cetera, I actually had mine done on family tree DNA, expecting to find Henrys, or at least a Henry. And I found Turnbulls, Turnbull, Trimbles, things of that nature. And I thought, wow, as far back as I've researched, I've been a Henry up through my father's male line. But apparently there must have been a slave owner named Turnbull or Trimble, or don't make assumptions. That's one of the key things I would say. It may have been a Turnbull or Trimble who had a relationship with an African and they had children. So it may not have been a slavery situation. May have been, may not have been.
The mystery deepens. I always say for every piece of information you get through doing research and even DNA, you just get more questions. You think you get answers, but you actually get more questions that you ask.
Exactly. So I have all these, pieces of paper, not literally, all over. Like I have to get back to the Turnbull Trimbles. I have to get back to the Rambo Swedish. And then on top of that, I have one son-in-law who's Italian and another one who's Jewish, and I researched them too. And so I'm researching every ethnicity you can think about.
You are the one-stop shop for genealogy. This is great. I do want to ask you this last question in terms of positive changes as the final one, but is there anything else about records that you wanted to communicate before I ask that question?
Not in particular. There are tons of things that are out there. So back in the day when Alex Haley wrote his book and came out with Kunta Kinte and Toby, and a lot of the things people assume apply to every person of African descent. They don't, as I've mentioned before. You have to really kind of dig into the context of the person that you're researching. And some of the information that is available now wasn't available when Alex Haley did his research. A lot of it is online. And this is heresy to say for our group, the Association of Professional Genealogists. A lot of it you can get online through ancestry.com or for free from familysearch.org. And both of those sites include wikis and all kinds of pages specifically on African-American genealogy research. So I'd strongly encourage people to look at the wikis, to look at the guides on ancestry.com or familysearch.org. And from there, you'll see a wealth of information in terms of other records you can look at. I've only touched on the tip of the iceberg. I didn't talk about in Pennsylvania, the septennial census. And for a time, they're actually listing the names of slaves in the septennial census. So those are actually on ancestry.com, believe it or not.
Yes, those are whatever survives of those, and it's not a complete set. Yes, is on
Right.
Ancestry. So people do get a little upset. They're like, "But my county's not on there," and it's like it doesn't
Yeah.
exist, or it hasn't, or it's still stuck in a basement somewhere. But as far as we know, it doesn't exist. So
And there was also another census that was done of African Americans in Philadelphia that's actually on ancestry.com. So I would definitely, if you have access to it, definitely use it. The library is a good source, but in the pandemic, that may be a problem to get access remotely. But familysearch.org, I strongly encourage people to look at that.
So, in the decade or so that you've been doing genealogy with a real focus, what have been the positive changes you've seen with African American research?
So there are all kinds of groups that have sprung up. I belong to a couple of African American history and genealogical society themes. One is the African American Genealogy Group, which is aagg.org. It's Philadelphia based, has no chapters, it's all in Philadelphia. But once you get like minds together, as I mentioned before, you can bounce ideas and really hone your skills. It actually first met at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. So it's like 6 degrees of separation. You go to this group and they tell you about this organization, different organizations in Philadelphia, the Charles Blockson collection at the Temple, at Temple University. You can go there to find more records there. So the advent of groups that you can go and network with, as I mentioned, more and more information is online, not just on genealogy themed websites, but just Googling things. Interesting story. I researched my wife's side of the family, and we found a letter in the basement that was given to her grandmother that actually traced from 2 African American children, ages 9 and 11, that were purchased by a lawyer in Connecticut in the 1600s. And 2 years later, they married and started having children, which are my wife's ancestors. The way I found out about a lot about him is because the name of one of her ancestors was so unusual. It was handwritten in this letter that was in our basement that my wife's mother brought when she came here. I Googled it and it just popped up. And someone by the name of Elise Guyette, who wrote about Black farmers in Vermont, had just written a book a couple of years earlier, and the name was in there throughout the whole book. So it's really amazing. So I highly recommend that if you want to read something about Blacks in New England. And they had a lot of acreage, farmland up there. But one of the advents, I'd say, is more and more being digitized, not only specific websites, but just that you can find through Googling. There's African American themed newspapers that are digitized now, like the Christian Recorder through the African Methodist Episcopal Church, for example, and other places as well. So I would say digitization of African American records and related material, that's been a huge, huge new development.
Excellent. Congratulations for finding family in a in a book that's been
Yeah,
published.
who knew? So
It's
they
fantastic.
actually moved from Connecticut to Vermont, and this author I mentioned, she lives in Vermont, and my wife and I were just on a panel discussion because they discovered that the person who owned my wife's ancestors had a school named after him, and they're like, wow, they didn't know that he owned slaves, a whole slave family. Actually, he started off with 2, and their increase became his property. So their eyes are opening up all over the country about what's going on, and people are really interested in filling out what we may not have learned in textbooks in grade school.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah, we were talking about that before we started about
Yes,
what we learned in school and what we've discovered through genealogy is just so much more nuanced and so much more complicated. And I'm thrilled that people are finally looking at people's whole history. And I just hope we don't cancel all these folks
exactly.
for what they did in the past, because they did what they did in their time period, and we wouldn't do that today at all.
Right.
But that's the way they were, and let's just talk about it and so we can process it together.
Yeah, and there's a difference between Robert E. Lee and George Washington. They both owned slaves, but they were totally different people. So I agree with you. You have to look at things in the context, because we're probably doing some things today that in 100 years, people say, I don't believe they actually did that
Right,
in
right.
2020.
Right. And we won't even know what it is because
we won't be around.
we won't be around. But our grandchildren will be like, I'm so embarrassed. Yeah. Like, oh. But Dean Henry, how can people get in touch with you if they want to use your services or they want to get in touch with the African-American Genealogy Group? And I'll drop this all in the show notes, and you provided me links, which is perfect. So people can just click. But
my website is familypearl.com. Now, people usually say www. You don't need that. Familypearl.com. Or you can reach me at my email, which is dean@familypearl.com. It's really easy when you start your own LLC. You can be your first name. So it's dean@familypearl.com. Those are two ways you can reach me. You asked about the African-American Genealogy Group. That's just aagg.org. And I mentioned another organization I belong to, which is actually national, called the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. That's a mouthful. So it's aahgs.org. And they have chapters throughout the United States. And I belong to the one in Philadelphia, which, just to confuse matter, changed their name to Family Quest. So that's one in Philadelphia. But for people in Pennsylvania, there's one also in Pittsburgh that's very big. And also close to Philadelphia, there's one in Delaware as well. But that's OGS.org was another website, so you can reach out to them as well.
All right. And Dean Henry, when you get your own podcast up and going, will you come back on the show and do an announcement?
Absolutely. So I have to say publicly, thanks, Denise, for getting me up to speed. I have my new Blue Yeti microphone, which I bought and didn't know what to do with, but now I've got my boom mic holder and my pop filter, and I'm anxious to use my new podcast software that you talked about. So thank you very much. But yes, I'm happy to come back.
I can't wait. As I said to you before, I just think family history and family stories is so much better through seeing people's faces if they're watching on video, but definitely through our voices. We as people used to sit around and tell stories about our families and where we came from. And I just think it's great. With technology, we can kind of get back to that and connect with all our family, no matter where they are, and all descendants, no matter where they are.
Yeah. And to your point, we talk a lot about as genealogists history or even current day, but we're not really recording our history for the future generations. We really owe that to the future generations. The technology is here. We should take advantage of it and just start talking about our memories while we still have them and they're still fairly clear, so that they can go back and they don't have to go through what we're going through to try to uncover them.
Well, it's a great way to wrap this up. So everyone out there, start noting down those family stories. And if you want to start a podcast, contact Dean and I. We'll cheer you on. Everyone should do a podcast. So thanks again, Dean, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to you. You're welcome. Yours.
Thank you again. Happy Kwanzaa. No, you don't leave anything out. Happy holidays, I think, captures everything. Yeah. So again, thanks for having me on the show, Denise.
All right. Thanks, Dean.
You're welcome.
That was a great conversation with Dean, and I hope you enjoyed all the resources that he mentioned. Don't forget, I always link them in the show notes, so you can click on those, get access to the various genealogy groups, history groups around African-American research and history, and of course books, because genealogists love books, and websites. So if this episode was helpful to you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. It's automatically downloaded for you. I also love your comments and feedback, as well as those clicks and likes and star ratings. They do help other people find the podcast because the algorithms know that people are listening and enjoying the episode. Next week, we're going to cover another major ethnic group in Pennsylvania. I'll let you wait and see who that is. This is Denise Allen. I am the founder of PAAncestors.com. You can find that in the show notes if you want to jump over to the website. I have a free newsletter with a free research guide, and I wish you many discoveries of your Pennsylvania ancestors.